Well, hello and welcome to this very first lesson in the series on the book of Genesis. Today we're going to be taking a look at the structure of the book of Genesis. So the purpose of these lessons, of these courses, is to give an insight into what the academic community is saying about certain books in the Hebrew Bible and in the New Testament. The Hebrew Bible is the name that we give to the Old Testament in the academic and scholarly community. Today in particular we're going to be looking at the structure of Genesis, so the way that Genesis is fit together, the way that it's been designed, the way that the different parts interact with one another, and the way that it can be sort of split up into different sections. One of the more simplistic ways that Genesis can be divided and split up is we can divide it on the type of origin that Genesis talks about. Genesis is a book of origins. It's a book talking about the formation and the start of many different things. And for example, in chapter 1 we have the origin of the world. So this is the sort of, maybe we could say this is the first section of Genesis structurally. And then with chapters 2 through chapters 11 we have instead the origin of the nations, and so this is talking instead, it's getting less specific. So it starts off talking about the origin of the world, and then we get the origin of the nations, the origin of different people groups, the origin of different cultures and arts, and then the next section we have is the origin of Israel. This is the final section in chapters 12 through 50. Now this divide is definitely there in Genesis, is definitely apparent, it's definitely something that's noticeable, but actually this is a sort of surface level divide when it comes to understanding the structure of Genesis. Actually, there's something more specific. There's something that's revealed by doing a really close study of the text, by doing a really close study of the Hebrew, that many scholars have come and done. So I'm going to explain what this more specific structure is. It's the structure that if you read an academic commentary on Genesis, you'll find some of the information that's presented here. So I've synthesized a lot of different scholarly sources about what they're saying about the book of Genesis. So there's a recurring phrase that is mentioned in Genesis an awful number of times, and this phrase is, these are the generations of. Actually, the first time we read this phrase in the book of Genesis is in Genesis chapter 2 verse 4, where we read, these are the generations of the heavens and the earth. And this phrase at the beginning, this phrase that says these are the generations, some translations of the Bible might say these are the descendants, some say these are the story of. There's lots of different ways in which this can be translated, but we're going to stick with just the same formula for now. And of course the first way in which this comes up is in Genesis 2 verse 4, where you read, these are the generations of the heavens and the earth. The next set of generations we get is we read that these are the generations of Adam, and then we get these are the generations of Noah, and then Noah's sons, and then of Shem, which is one of Noah's sons. So these are the just 5 examples of this phrase that we read in the book of Genesis. This word generations, it's of course the English translation, but the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament, is written in Hebrew, and actually the word for generations in Hebrew is actually the word toledot. So this is the Hebrew word for it. So when we read in the English Bible, these are the generations of heaven and earth, in the Hebrew it says these are the toledot of heaven and earth. And when we read in the English Bible, these are the generations of Noah, in the Hebrew Bible it says these are the toledot of Noah. So this means that this sort of phrase, these are the generations, scholars or academics, they tend to call this phrase the Toledot formula. So whenever you see these are the generations, this is the Toledot formula. So these are the generations of heaven and earth, this is the Toledot formula, or the Toledot of the heavens and earth. And when we read these are the generations of Noah, this is the Toledot formula, or the Toledot of Noah. Actually, the word Genesis, which is of course the English title for the name of the first book in the Hebrew Bible, Genesis, actually it finds its roots in this word toledot. So, of course, in the Hebrew, we have this word toledot. Now, many New Testament and early church writers, when they read the Old Testament, they didn't actually just read the Hebrew Old Testament, they actually read the Greek Old Testament. And the Greek Old Testament is called the Septuagint, or the LXX, because apparently, and it's really a rumour or a folk tale, but apparently 70 people translated it, and that's where we get that Septuagint name from. But in the Septuagint, these are the generations of heaven and earth. These are the toledot of heaven and earth. The word that is translated toledot in the Greek Old Testament is the word genesios. And genesios is an inflected form. So it's a form where because of a change in meaning, it's sort of changed the way that it looks, of a Greek word which the root of which is Genesis. So we have essentially Genesis, are the letters there. And this transliterated, so if we spell it letter for letter, gives us the English word Genesis. So actually, this toledot formula is so influential and important when it comes to the structure of the book of Genesis that it actually influenced its name. And so we're going to take a look a little bit more at this toledot formula, which is evidently so influential because it helped to make the name Genesis come about. Just as a matter of interest, in Hebrew, the name of the Hebrew book which we call Genesis isn't called Toledot, it isn't called Genesis, it's actually called Bereshith. Bereshith is the first word in the book of Genesis, and it means in the beginning. So we all are probably aware of that very famous opening in Genesis. So in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And that Hebrew word Bereshith is where the Hebrew name for Genesis comes from, but we have a transliteration of the Greek which comes from this word toledot. So the toledot structure then, so if we're talking about what is the structure in the book of Genesis, what we could say that Genesis has a toledot structure. And this is because Genesis has been structured around this repeating phrase. I mean, you can see that there are actually 10 different toledot formula used. So we have the generations of heavens and earth, generations of Adam, generations of generations of Noah's sons, of Shem, of Terah, of Ishmael, of Isaac, of Esau, and of Jacob. And it's this recurring phrase, this recurring toledot formula, that gives us the name of the toledot structure. And so the answer to, or how do most academics, how do most scholars see the book of Genesis being structured, is actually structured with a toledot structure. That's what we could say. And so this is how most scholars therefore structure Genesis. So they structure it like this. So we've got a prologue at the beginning, which is chapter 1 verse 1 into chapter 2 verse 3. So this doesn't contain any toledot formula, and then after this we have the 10 toledot formulas that come to form this toledot structure. As a sort of matter of a side note, you'll notice if you actually read Genesis 36, which is where the toledot of Esau is, actually these are the generations of Esau, or these are the descendants of Esau. It actually appears twice, but because it's talking about the same set of generations, for the purpose of the formula, it's only included once. So there are actually more ways than just the toledot formula of sort of dividing up Genesis, of analysing and understanding its structure. So one of these ways is by noting and observing the two different types of history that's present in the book of Genesis. So the first 5 toledot formula that are used, these are the generations of heavens and the earth, of Adam, of Noah, of Noah's sons, and of Shem. This is called the primeval history, because this section in Genesis is focusing on the whole of mankind. It deals with the origins of cultures, of nations, of the world, and of this flood that happens, that we'll take a look at in one of the future lessons. Actually, this is the first section of Genesis, and it's important to note that this section here contains 5 of the Toledot, which means that the next section of history in the book of Genesis that's used to structure Genesis, the patriarchal history, and this also includes 5, bringing that total up to 10. So we have the generations of Terah. You might not know who Terah is. Terah is actually an ancestor of Abraham. So in the Hebrew Bible, in the book of Genesis, we don't have the formula of these are the generations of Abraham, but we do have these are the generations of Terah, who is one of Abraham's descendants. There are many reasons as to why this might be, and there'll be a link to that. If you scroll down after this video, you should see a little explanation of why that should be. But this section of history, which includes the generations of Terah through to the generations of Jacob, this is called the patriarchal history. And the reason for this is that it's focusing on the history of the forebearers, of the forefathers of Israel. And that word father is where we get this word patriarchal or patriarchal from. It's got a Greek root. And so this section talks about the patriarchal history. This contrasts actually to the first to the primeval history, because it's got more of a specific focus. So that the primeval history really focuses universally, it focuses on the whole world and the whole of creation, whereas the patriarchal history tends to focus a lot more on the nation of Israel, and that includes these patriarchs, so Abraham, Isaac and Jacob, and their families, and the origin of significant neighbours to Israel. So they're the nations of Moab, of Ammon and of Edom. Now, the first 5 Toledots are these Toledot that come to form the primeval history. Actually, you'll probably notice that as it goes down the Toledot, that actually the focus becomes more specific. So the first Toledot is the generations of heavens and earth. So this is talking about the whole of creation. And then the next one we get, which is, I believe it's in chapter 5 verse 1, it's the generations of Adam. So this now has narrowed down from heavens and earth, so from talking about the whole of creation to talking about one particular species in that whole of creation. So now we're talking about Adam, who is the first human. And then from this particular species we get one particular family. So we get Noah and we get the sons of Noah. So again we've got more and more specific. And then the very last Toledot in the primeval history is Shem. And so once again we get even more specific, and we have this narrowed down into one particular individual, from one particular family, from one particular race, from the whole of creation, represented in the first 5 Toledot. And this is making a point. And this is making a point of transition between the primeval history and the patriarchal history. And because what it's saying is it's saying that we're gradually getting more specific and specific and specific until we get to this line of covenant descendants, which we see in the patriarchal history. And here it is. So here's the patriarchal history. Now the patriarchal history focuses on this thematic promise of covenant. So this way in which God relates to the people of Israel. And this is one of the ways in which this is manifest is through descendants. And so actually the set of Toledot, the set of generations we see in the patriarchal history of Genesis actually is really representative for this. So it starts off with almost like the first person in the covenant line. So in the case of Genesis 11, which is where the generations of Terah begin, we have Terah, who fathers Abraham, and then we get the non-covenant line generations presented. So we have, and these are the generations of Terah, and then afterwards we get these are the generations of Ishmael. Now Ishmael isn't someone who receives the blessing of the covenant line. Instead it's Isaac who appears next in the Toledot formula, and then this repeats once again. So we have these are the generations of Isaac, then after this comes these are the generations of Esau, and now Esau is a part of that non-covenant line, and then we get finally these are the generations of Jacob. So it's always the case in the patriarchal history that the first person who gets mentioned as a descendant is someone who isn't a part of the covenant line, and the second person is the one person who is. So we have Ishmael who isn't, Isaac who is, Esau who isn't, and then Jacob who is. So here we can see that divide between the primeval history and the patriarchal history. So we have that first 5 being the primeval and the last 5 being the patriarchal. If you're wondering if there's a significance about the number 5 as to why it's the number 5, the book of Genesis is a part of a collection of books known as the Pentateuch. The Pentateuch is a collection of 5 books. That's Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers and Deuteronomy. And so some have suggested that this sort of structure of 5 is reflective of the Pentateuch itself. So there's something really significant about dividing these sections into sections of 5. There are actually two kinds of these Toledot formula used. So remember, the Toledot formula is every time we read these are the generations of. The two kinds we have the numerical Toledot and we have the narrative Toledot. So numerical Toledot is any time the phrase "these are the generations of" appears, and then afterwards, instead of a narrative account, instead of some detailed story, for an example the flood, instead of something like that, we get instead just a list of more descendants. So an example of this is the generations of Adam in chapter 5 verse 1. So we have these are the Toledot, these are the generations of Adam. Now this is a numerical Toledot because after that set of generations all we get are more descendants. On the other hand, we have these narrative Toledot. Now, narrative Toledot, an example which I've already mentioned is these are the generations, or these are the Toledot of Noah. So after this, rather than a large genealogy, a large list of descendants, instead we get a detailed narrative story. So we get the story of the disobedience on the people of earth and the flood that God brings as an act of judgment on the earth. So here we go. Here's an example of one of these numerical Toledot. So this is the generations of Adam. So we have the generations of Adam. We have Adam fathered Seth, and we have Seth fathered Enosh, and we have Enosh fathered Kenan, and then this goes on and it goes on and it goes on. As a narrative Toledot, we have these are the generations of Noah, and then we have Noah was a righteous man, blameless in his generation. He walked with God, and he had 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. So that's the only kind of genealogical description we have of Noah. But instead of any more genealogies after that, we instead begin the story. We begin the story of, now the earth was corrupt in God's sight, and the earth was filled with violence. And God saw the earth, and behold, it was corrupt. And so we get this narrative account. And the other places we see this is in the generations of the heavens and the earth, the generations of Terah, the generations of Isaac, and the generations of Jacob. So here we can see, once again, we have 5 and 5, a set of 5 and 5 set of generations, or Toledot. So the generations of heaven and earth, of Noah, of Terah, of Isaac, and of Jacob are all ones with narrative purpose. And the generations of Adam, Noah's sons, Shem, Ishmael, and Esau are all the ones which have a numerical purpose to them. There are also some lexical differences in terms of the actual word Toledot, this word that is translated generations. Within the Hebrew grammar, there are 2 different uses. There are 2 different ways in which this is used. There's independent clauses, which is represented by this image of a cat, because cats tend to be independent, and there are coordinate clauses, and we've got a line of lines hunting in packs. The difference between these is essentially an independent clause is a standalone statement. So when the Toledot is being used as a part of an independent clause, it's being used as a standalone statement. When it's being used by a coordinate clause, in a coordinate clause, it's being used as a statement that's a part of something bigger. So it's coordinate, it works with something else. Now, getting your head around the grammar is an essential. I certainly haven't got my head around it myself. But actually, when we follow this structure and this formula, we can come up with an alternative Toledot structure. So we'll see here actually that we've got, if we take all of the uses of the Toledot, all the uses of this word generations, that are part of an independent clause, we can come up with these 5, and once again we've got these 5 headings. We've got of heaven and earth, of Adam, of Noah, of Shem, and of Jacob. And then if we take the ones which are coordinate clauses, we can make these subheadings. So this is an alternative Toledot structure that can be used. So to conclude then, Genesis is a book of origins. It's a book about the origins of the world, the origins of the nations, and the origins of Israel. There are 10 Toledot formula, which introduce a new development of history and primarily structure Genesis. So there are those generations. We've got the generations of heaven and earth. We've got the generations of Adam, of Noah, of Noah's sons, of Shem, of Terah, of Ishmael, of Isaac, of Esau, and of Jacob. And these structure the text. We say Genesis has a toledot structure. The first 5 toledot they use to form the primeval history. And the last 5 come to form the patriarchal history. 5 of the toledot formula have a narrative purpose, and the other 5 have a numerical purpose. And the toledot formula generally tend to move towards specificity, and in the patriarchal history it includes covenantally rejected members. An alternative structure is to have these 5 major headings along with a prologue. Well, thank you very much for watching this first video. If you finish watching this video, if you scroll down to the bottom or check the link in the description, you should have a guide which sort of talks through some of the things that I've been saying, as well as has a little bit of extra information on why the generations of Abraham aren't included, but it's the generations of Terah instead. And as well as this, it contains the bibliography as to the different commentaries and sources that I used, just to make sure I was sort of getting things right. There will be a quiz available after this one as well if you want to do a quiz, and there should be more content coming soon. I think we're going to take a look at Genesis 1. We're going to take a look at what the academic community is saying about this, about how do people who study biblical studies view this text. Thank you very much for watching. Goodbye.